we're kind of, Paul kind of changes gears here, and so I guess we will too. But for the last couple of weeks, chapter 8 and chapter 9 dealt with the subject of giving. And so, tried to cover that up one side and down the other. And just quickly, by way of review, and please understand, again, I'm not out to get anybody, and it's not an area that I'm so much as it would argue as I would I have to teach and to preach the truth. And I'm not the one that discovered this. There's plenty of people out there that know and understand that the tithe of the Old Testament was for the children of Israel, and it was for the Old Testament time, and it was for a specific purpose. In fact, the tithe in Israel was almost like what I would equate to our modern day tax system. Understand, God was nation building at that time, and Israel was His chosen people. And so the offices and the administration that was carried out through the priesthood in the Levitical tribe of the priests dealt with not only the spiritual aspects, but it even went into, they were the ones that made decisions as far as governmental type decisions for the nation of Israel. And all that money that went to the tribe of Levi was for that purpose. And so it was almost a system of tax. And in the New Testament, and again, quickly moving on from this, how much should you give as a Christian? The answer is not 10%. The answer becomes whatever you want to. And just understand that God knows what you have. God knows your heart. God knows where you're at on all of that. You give as much as you want to or as little as you want to. God's not going to be mad at you one way or the other. God's not going to send the devil to collect. Again, people like to say stuff like that, but you can't just say stuff and make it true. There's no scripture to support that, and so I won't tell you that. And I don't have an agenda to meet. I'm not looking to make money. I'm not looking to get paid. I'm not looking to increase anything. And as I mentioned last week, though I think that building a...
Is there a pen under there?
Yeah. Want one? And as I mentioned last week, though I think building a building and having a building is extra biblical, I don't think it's evil or wrong. And if a group of people want to get together and build a place to all meet and to worship and to gather together and to fellowship, and we have those freedoms to do that in this country, okay, go for it. And if you're going to be a part of it, you ought to contribute a little bit to it. It costs money to turn the lights on. It costs money to have water. It costs money to pay for the building of the building that we're still doing and almost done with. But just understand, you haven't given anything to God by doing that. That's an agreement and a thing that we decided as a group of people that we wanted to do. It's fine to support that and it's fine to give to that, but that's not the end of our obligation, nor is it our work of service for the Lord. And so again, how much do you give? Give as much as you want to. Whatever the Lord would lay on your heart, it's fine to give more, it's fine to give less. There were times, and again I mentioned it last week, and I'm trying to quickly move on, but I just want to make sure everybody understands. There were times when people were the recipients of other people's giving because they had nothing. Some people would tell you that it doesn't matter if you can't make your bills, if you can't pay anything, you need to tithe. I'm not. Later still works. Okay? And if you owe $1,000 and you have $800, giving an extra $200 to something else is not going to make your situation better. And I think sometimes they try to bring it in like somehow it will just magically work out. I'm not being mean, but it's math. It doesn't always work out. Now, on the flip side, if you blow your money on all kinds of different things and don't have enough to do anything, that's different, but still, just understand, math is math. mathematical certainties. The only times that God did things that defied the laws of math and human knowledge were miraculous. Okay? Feeding 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Now the math doesn't work on that. But He doesn't choose to do that every week in your bank account. Okay? Math is still math. And so, again, there are times, and I'm not talking about self-inflicted. Okay? Again, you go out and get a house payment, a car payment, 3 or 4 credit cards and charge it all up to where you really can't pay the payments off of what you make. You did that to yourself. Okay? But there are genuinely times where, you lose a job, you have a major happening in your life. Understand that God understands that. And He's not expecting you to take away from your families being able to eat and to do the things that they need to do in order to give to something else. There were times where Christians were the recipients of the giving. And the whole idea, Paul said last week, that there might be an equality, was that in other times where God blessed and God gave plenty, those people were giving of their excess to help others. And I think that would be the balance, and that's what God looks for. God is not going to look at how much did you give. I think God's going to look at it more like how much did you keep and waste on yourself. That you could have given and you could have done something for somebody else with, to an excess. Again, we have to eat, we have to have clothes, we have to do things like that. But, again, does God want us to have a new car every year? Probably not. When we could help somebody else. And again, you do what you want to do. It is completely between you and God, and I think you'll be blessed for doing it, but I do not think that you will be cursed or beat up for not doing it. Okay? So that's enough of that. Hold on, that wasn't even on the slides. That was all free. Alright, so now in chapter 10, as I said, Paul switches gears a little bit. He's going to deal with another, I know I wasted way too much time on that. But in chapter 10, Paul's going to change gears a little bit, and he's going to start addressing, I think, some charges that were made against him. There had been some people who had maybe suggested that, Paul wasn't real, or Paul wasn't really dedicated like he ought to be, or Paul wasn't outspoken enough like he should be at times. Again, everybody's a judge when they're looking at somebody else. We're all, whether we like to admit it or not, we're all a little bit of a Saturday morning quarterback on some things. It's like, well, I would have done it different. I would have done
It's easy looking at it in different directions.
Exactly. And and here's the thing, the reason they say hindsight's 20/20 is we'd all look at things that we've said or done in the past and say, I could have done a whole lot better with that. But Paul's going to start addressing some of these issues, but in the middle of all of that, the lessons learned are applicable not just to Paul's life, but to our life as Christians, because we as Christians should be bold when it comes to professing to be Christians and to sharing our faith. And so Paul begins to talk about that a little bit here. So let's read the first 3 verses. It kind of sets the tone for chapter 10, and we'll get started.
Now I, Paul, myself, beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am based among you, but being absent am bold toward you.
But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh.
For though we walk in the flesh, we do not after the flesh. We do not war after the flesh.
Okay. So as Paul opens up chapter 10, and of course I know it's he didn't write chapter 10 and then start writing again, but he does, it probably was definitely the break of a paragraph or something, because the topic changes and the idea changes. But he says, now I, Paul, myself, beseech you. And that means to to strongly encourage, to beg you to listen to what I'm saying. And he says, by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. And Paul brings that into mind here because of some of the accusations and some of the things that he's going to address here. He brings to mind the fact that, when Jesus Christ was here, predominantly he was meek and gentle. Now, everybody remembers, and he in fact did, drive the money changers out of the temple a couple of times. And he dealt fairly harshly with the religious leaders of his day, the Jewish people. But in most cases and in all reality, he was mostly meek and gentle towards people. He let people know he was serious, but he also had a love for people. And so he reminds these Corinthians here of the fact that Christ was meek and gentle, and he says, who in presence am base among you. And apparently it was Paul's custom that when he was present with the church, and especially here, but I think probably most everywhere that he went, Paul chose not to make a big deal of himself. And again, I'm not naming names or anything, but there's some preachers that it's like when they come to town, they kind of make a big deal about, oh, I'm brother, whoever. And Paul didn't really do that. And Paul didn't really do a big, huge production. And it says here, he says, the idea being that he says, when I'm present, I'm base among you. I'm kind of soft-spoken, I'm kind of laid back, I'm kind of not so forward when I'm with you. In other words, when Paul came and talked with them in their church, and when they were gathered together, Paul didn't make a big deal out of the fact that he was Paul. Okay? And he says, but being absent and bold towards you. And it was also Paul's custom, as we've read in places in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that when he wrote a letter back to them, sometimes he was kind of bold. Fact of the matter is, it's almost understandable as part of human nature. Are you more bold when you talk to somebody face to face, or when you send them like a text message or an email or something? Yeah, you'll say stuff that you wouldn't really say if you were face to face with them. It's easier. It's really human nature. It's easier to be bold when you write something. And I don't know how many, because I've done it myself. I'm sure it's happened to one or two other people, but there's probably been more than me that's typed something out to send to somebody and then thought about it for a second and then been like, nah, better not.
Once I said something to my supervisor when it was supposed to be my mom, and it was talking about my supervisor. And because this was my first job when I was working with somebody from my mom's work. I was like a cleaning person, and I was like, oh my gosh. She texted me back. I was like, oh my gosh. I literally quit like a week after.
And so yeah, it does happen, but it was Paul's custom that his letters were more weighty, and I use that word because he uses it here in just a couple of verses, than his speech when he was present, meaning that he addressed more issues and got on to people a little bit more in his letters. And so I think some people might have suggested that Paul was not genuine because he would say things in absence that he wouldn't say in presence. But Paul is going to explain here, he did those things beforehand so that when he got there, he could enjoy fellowship with fellow brothers and sisters rather than having to come into town and fix all the problems once he got there. Meaning, it's hard. It's kind of like when your mom or dad gets on to you, fellowship for about the next 15 or 20 minutes, And Paul's kind of getting across here, I don't want to come into town, make everybody mad, and then have to be here with you while we're all kind of ill at each other. I'd rather address those things beforehand, and then when I come, we can have fellowship. And so, but he says, but I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence. And I think Paul's getting across here that he would rather be bold in the letters than he would when he's present. Wherewith I think to be bold against some. So now there's these that are accusing him, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. And also, there were some that thought that Paul ought to do his ministry different. Now, trust me, if you ever try to do any kind of ministry, there'll always be somebody that thinks you ought to do it different. Mind you, they won't do anything themselves, but they're just, you'll be like, you'll hear people all the time, well, I just don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we ought to teach or preach like that. I don't think we ought to go here. I don't think we ought to invite people like this. I don't, on and on and on and on. It's like, well, how do you do it? Well, I don't. Okay. I like my way of doing it better than your way of not doing it, But he says, as though we walk according to the flesh. And then verse 3, he says, for though we walk in the flesh. And this is important, and this is the topic for the next few verses, okay? Christianity is unique in some ways. Now, there are other religions, I'll agree, that are mostly peaceful, okay? But, Christianity is never been a religion of force or terrorism or anything like that. Now, obviously, I know the Muslim religion comes to mind first, but there's many others.
Catholics, way back when, they were pretty bad too.
Not the true form of Christianity.
Exactly, and that is
They
why.
took the name of Christians.
Exactly, and again, you mentioned it, so it bears mentioning. Understand, when the Roman Empire dissolved, there's a reason it's called the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, when the Roman Empire dissolved into nothing really, it lost its power and its effect to a certain extent. Understand that people picked up on the fact, Constantine being one of them, hey, this Christianity movement, it's got a lot of weight and it's got a lot of spread. I mean, the gospel had been spread to the world by the time you're talking around 300 AD now. Okay, Paul was gone, all the originals was gone, but the gospel message had been carried basically to the ends of the known world at that time, and it had received a huge amount of converts and notoriety and stuff. And those that wanted power and those that wanted to use that looked at it and said, we can use this to our advantage. And they basically took on the form of Christianity, the Crusades and all of those things that you hear about. And some incredibly horrible and cruel things were done in the name of Christianity. But just because you put a cross on the front of your armor and claim to be fighting for the cause of Christ doesn't mean you're a Christian. And again, that's why I'm very careful, because when you read, for instance, news articles and things like that says there's, this much percentage of the population is Christian. Well, understand.
Falls under Methodists.
Right. They're just anybody from, Catholics are lumped in, and I would just strongly, disagree with the fact. Again, are there some Catholics that are Christian? Probably so. To say are Catholics Christian is no different than saying, well, are all Baptists Christian?
Some Jewish Christians as well.
Exactly. Well, really and truthfully, only true Christians are Christians. Yeah. And so there's those in all areas.
You got the Christian religion, you got Christianity.
Exactly. And those two have always been different. The true church is only the believers. And the facts of the matter are this, regardless of whether it's Grace Baptist Church in Whitesburg or the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, when the church is called out, when the church is separated, the true church is separated from everything else, there will be those left that were part of the assembly, but were never part of the church. It's sad, but it's the truth. The numbers just are, it's going to be there, I can tell you. Even Jesus called 12 disciples, just 12. One of them was never real. Judas Iscariot was never a real disciple, and he was never a true follower of Christ. In just those 12. So I'm telling you, there are people who like the idea of Christianity. They like the idea of the things of God. They like to put on like they're a Christian. They're not Christian. And that's true with a lot of different facets of the religion, but it's just the fact. But anyway, the Roman Catholic Church was the first one to really use the name of Christianity. The Jews had done it too from the Old Testament. They used the Jew persona to say that they were God's chosen people. God's chosen people in the Old Testament was still those that believe by faith in God, just like Abraham. In the New Testament in Romans,
The Jew doesn't make you.
exactly, just being born in the bloodline of Abraham did not make you truly a child of God and a chosen person of God. That's what people misinterpret sometimes. Even Paul in Romans said all those that say they are Jews are not Jews. Again, those Jewish people, they said, hey, we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when he was standing in front of them, he says, you're of your father the devil. If you really believed in the God of Isaac, Jacob, and Abraham, you'd believe in me because I'm him. They claimed to be God's people, but they weren't. They didn't truly believe in the God of heaven, and so or the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Bible. Just like today. There's people that claim to be Christians, and they believe in God, but it's not the God of the Bible. Whatever it is they believe in, it's not Him, because they're not truly a Christian. But anyway, just keep in mind the force. There's even modern sects of Christianity that think that we ought to try to, for instance, the type that blow up abortion clinics, the type that, that assassinate,
Radicals.
Exactly.
It's like the world's view of Muslim terrorists.
Exactly. We don't nowhere at all does the Bible teach us that the weapons of our warfare are carnal. Meaning we don't use guns and knives and bombs to make people convert to Christianity or to fix the world.
Keyword right there. We can't make them.
That's not a
Because
true.
that-
Yeah, there's no truth in that conversion of somebody.
Make them say it, but that doesn't.
Exactly, and that ultimately proves why just simply saying a prayer doesn't save. Like you can teach a parrot to talk. Saying words doesn't mean anything. It's the belief of the heart.
Understand the meaning of it all.
Exactly, and so just keep this thought in mind as we go forward. Two thoughts actually. One, that we're going to be in chapter 10 next week, and two, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. It says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. We don't do battle the way that the world does battle. I would even throw in here, we don't battle by traditional means of fighting. We also don't battle by means of the ballot box. It's fine if you want to vote your convictions, that's fine. But that's not how we win. You don't turn America into a Christian nation by making enough laws that line up with the Bible, because it doesn't change the hearts of man.
If you vote, you're going to make somebody mad. If you vote or don't vote, you're going to make somebody mad. If
Exactly.
you vote for so-and-so, you're going to make them mad. If you vote for so-and-so. And if you don't vote, they're going to be like, well, why didn't you help them?
And again, I remind people, Jesus lived in a time of horrible, horrible Roman oppression and government and rule over Christianity. Never once did he even take time to mention it or talk about it. In fact, he said, my kingdom's not of this world. The world does what the world does, and it will always do what the world does. And it is an exercise in futility to try to change the world through means of voting or politicians. Again, it's fine. I wouldn't vote for, somebody who's more evil, but just understand that's not the way we fix everything. America's not a Christian nation. The truth of the matter is it's never been a Christian nation. The definition of a Christian nation would be a nation where all the people are Christian. Has that ever been the case? No, it's not a Christian nation. Are there some Christian principles that was founded upon? Absolutely. And those are not bad things. But just understand, it doesn't make everything that we do here all right just because we founded it on some Christian principles. And so, just understand, that's not how we fight. The only reason I bring that up is because there's kind of tended to be a push towards confrontational, approach to how we look at politics these days. I think we ought to be less involved in politics and more involved in Christianity, because the two are really totally separate from each other. And it's amazing to me how bold, how brash, how much people will say and almost invite, hey, you disagree with me, I want you to disagree with me, I like you to disagree with me because I'm strong and I'm being bold about it. And they'll do it for politics, but they won't do it for their faith.
Be all quiet and all that.
Yeah, it's like, are you a Christian? Well, I think that's kind of a personal thing. Well, you're really, really good about being Republican. Maybe we should focus our attention just a little bit more as the church on the true task at hand, which is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And for this reason, Paul says, for though we walk in the flesh, and we all walk in the flesh, we live in this world, we do not war after the flesh. We don't fight the same fight that the world fights. We don't fight it the same way. And he goes on to say, gotta go forward, hold on. Getting out of sorts here. All right. For he goes on to say, and I'll read just to save a little time. He says, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We're in a fight. That's for sure. There's definitely opposition. But we don't fight the way the world fights. Person until they, succumb. That's not how Christianity works.
We win by getting beat up while telling them about how to.
Exactly. He says they're not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Now, though we don't use guns, though we don't use knives, though we don't use force, are our weapons insufficient?
No.
Not at all. In fact, they're even stronger and far more reaching than those that the world has. He says they're able to pull down strongholds. And again, we forget these things sometimes even in our own Christian life. Now this is specifically talking about things in the world. But hey, the weapons that God gives us in our Christian life, the Word, the Spirit, go to Ephesians if you want to, talking about the armor of God, that's the weapons of our warfare.
Paul talks about us when we follow God, we're more than conquerors.
Exactly. More than conquerors. Conquerors are powerful and wonderful. We're more than that. We're even able to do more than they are. And so what I mean by that is there a stronghold in your life or my life that needs pulling down? Is there some sin? Is there something that you just can't get the victory over? You have the weapons necessary to get past it. You just have to utilize them. Okay? If you're Seriously, this is important. This is something that all Christians need to hear. If you're trying to get sin out of your life in the energy of the flesh by just simply resisting it in the energy of the flesh, it doesn't work. Your flesh will fail you every time. You better find something bigger and better than that to fall back on when it comes to pulling down those strongholds. And he goes on to say in verse 5, he says, casting down imaginations. And again, this is more directed at the world, but the practical application can be made in our own lives. He says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. Now, again, in Paul's day, there was definitely this out there. In our day, there's still this out there. There's some heavy things to overcome. There's science, there's evolution, there's humanism, there's humanistic thinking, there's all of this new, cancel culture, whatever you want to call it, correctness, all of these imaginations of man's hearts are. The Word of God cuts straight down through to the truth of the matter is, and that you will never fix man, and you will never fix society, and you will never fix injustice apart from the Word of God and the Spirit of God. Because the human heart, the Bible said, is desperately wicked. You'll never fix all the injustice in the world. And he says, and this is Aaron's right. This is a tough one right here. And bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Oh, the thought life. And again, the reason I can say that is because I know it's hard. The thought life is where the battle is fought at, really. That's where it begins. And learning how to bring into and Paul speaks in terms of warfare. Okay, remember the gist of what he's saying is here, though our weapons are not carnal and they're not the same, there's still a battle and there's still warfare. And if you think there's not a battle and you think there's not a fight that goes on inside of each and every one of us, then I don't know that I can help you here. But if you're really truly a Christian, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say the battle within. Mm-hmm. The new man versus the old man, or woman, as it be. Okay? Bringing into captivity every thought. Now, understand, and this is true for anything. There's no way I'm going to stand here this morning and tell you that I've brought into captivity every thought. But we ought to try. That's the thing about it. We teach and we preach a message that is far greater. Paul taught and preached a message that was far greater than him or than I. There's nobody that can stand and preach the Bible with their own authority and say that they have done and followed everything that it says. Nobody's perfect. We're all flawed. But the message is bigger and greater than all of us, and we can still preach the message. Why? Because it's not our message. It's not me telling you to bring into captivity every thought. It's God telling you to bring into captivity every thought. And it's just as applicable to me as it is to you. To the obedience of Christ. The thought life. And I digress here, and again, we'll be in chapter 10 next week. I digress here to a verse of Scripture that I really, really love in Philippians. And I think really and truly, the Bible has all the answers. We just don't want to take time to implement the answers in our own lives.
Or even sometimes to look for them.
Exactly. Honestly, I think there's a reason that a lot of Christians don't like or want to read the Bible. It's because they already know what a lot of it says.
They just don't want to face it.
And it's not any fun to face. But the true fact of the matter is, that Paul's saying here, that there's a battle first in the mind. And again, Paul's speaking externally, but it's also internal as well. Paul's saying we got to do battle against the evil and the wicked in the world and the thoughts and intents of man's hearts that's unregenerate. But we also have to bring into captivity the thoughts of our own heart that even though we are regenerate, we're saved.
We are saved. We're still human beings.
Exactly. And we can wind up in ineffective for the cause of Christ if we're not careful about these things. And again, so I bring your attention Philippians chapter 4, and this is if every Christian in this church would just implement verse 8 in their own life, it would be incredible how much difference it would make in the heart and the mind of a Christian. Okay? Paul here says, finally, brethren. Now, if you go back and you read chapter 4 in Philippians, Paul is dealing with an array of topics, but here he lands on the topic of thought life. Okay? He says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true. And he goes through a whole list, and I'm just bear with me. Whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report. If there be any virtue, if there be any praise, what's that last line? Think on these things. Now, and this is what I mean. If everybody in this church would just implement this one verse in their life, okay? Let's put what we watch on TV into this verse. Let's put what we listen to on the radio in this verse. Let's put what video games we play into this verse. Let's put what we sit and think about and talk about into this verse. And again, there's different things. But let's just a for instance, and again, this is for everybody. But to be honest with you, there's a reason why I haven't watched a movie or a TV show in forever. And it's because when you plug it into this right here, let's just say we made a rule in our house, your house, okay, that whatever we were going to watch, we were going to justify it by this verse right here. How much TV would we watch?
Not a whole lot.
Probably not much. How much music would we listen to? How many video games? You plug it in, but he's saying here that whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, and full of virtue and praise. Let's think on those things. Let's not think on worldly things. Let's not think on evil things. Let's not think on things that are sadistic and wicked and vile, and I mean, you fill in the blanks. But that's what the world lives for. The more twisted and the more evil and the more, they sit around trying to think of more and more evil ways to portray and to do things, and it's like there hasn't been enough ways to kill somebody in a movie. I mean, that stuff is evil and satanic. I don't want to sit and watch that. I mean, it sure doesn't line up with this. But whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, and full of virtue and praise. This is Paul writing here also to the Philippians. He says, think on these things. Bring your thought life into subjection to the mind and heart of Christ. Again, it's tough. The mind wanders. The mind, gets on a thought but here's the thing. That's where the reason this is so important. That's where it all starts. Where did David's sin for Bathsheba start? Now I understand it was with a look, and it was probably accidental.
But he gave thought about it.
Instead of just saying, "Oh, can't do that. Let me move on to something else." What did David do? He sat there and he thought about it, and he says, "You know, I'm the king. I can do anything I want to do." Oh, and he could, and he did. But at the end of it, his own thought life, if you had asked David the day before he saw bathing, if you had asked David, "David, do you think there's any way that you would ever lust after a woman, find out she's married, and still bring her into your house, and then after it was all over and she wound up pregnant, that you would have her husband executed?" What would David have said?
No.
There's no way I'd ever do anything like that. But that's exactly what David did. A man who the Bible calls a man after God's own heart allowed his thoughts to take him down a road, and once he started down the road,
You give ground, it's over.
and that's why, again, it's better off if we don't put all of that evil thought and evil things into our mind and into our thought life on a consistent basis, because that's what we will revert to.
Whatever you feed, like the dog analogy,
Mm-hmm.
you got two dogs fighting, the spirit and the flesh. Which one you feed more is going to win.
Exactly. And if you constantly yield to the flesh, you just naturally tend to bend that way.
It makes trying to serve God and resist temptation many times harder.
Exactly. And we wind up in a cycle of disappointment and grief and hurt. Because if you're truly saved, it only brings temporary enjoyment, and then afterwards it's
Days of
exactly.
bad.
And what's so sad about it is even though we know it brings that, we'll still do it, and we'll still go through the cycle. And so again, it's a process, and the Christian life is not easy. Those that say, "Oh, being a Christian is the easiest thing you'll ever do." Now, being a real Christian is the hardest thing you'll ever do. It takes resolve. It takes dedication.
Sacrifice.
It takes sacrifice. Mm-hmm. It takes all kinds of things.
It takes everything you got.
Mm-hmm. Is it worth it?
Absolutely.
Definitely. Do very few people ever really realize that it's worth it? Yeah. There's very few that realize. Most people just, after that cycle for a little while, they just give up. They get tired of fighting it. They get tired of battling it. But he says, "Whatsoever these things are, think on these things." And I'm going to have to quit there. And as we begin next week, just keep this in mind. Paul says to have in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. We ought to seek vengeance on the sin in our lives and in the lives of others. And that's strong wordage. And again, he's talking in terms of warfare here as he's describing that. So we'll end there. We'll try to finish this next week. I appreciate y'all being here.